Make every night a wonderful journey, no matter where you are. Good night, sweet dreams. The first story, Volponi's basement. Even today, just hearing the word basement still sends a slight shiver down my spine, even though it's been about 35 years since the events in my childhood memories occurred. The word cellar provokes a similar response in me, although to a slightly lesser degree. In the movie Donnie Darko, Drew Barrymore's character claims that a famous linguist, it was actually J.R. Tolkien, once said that the phrase cellar door is the most beautiful combination of words in the English language. Well, he was wrong for saying it in the first place, and she was wrong for repeating it and perpetuating the idea that the phrase is somehow beautiful. It's not. It's downright disturbing. Fuck that. And fuck HER. And fuck THACMOVIEN. Fuck TOVIEN. Even though I really did actually like the movie. And Tolkien, fuck ALL of them. Right up the rear. And for using that phrase. Cellar door is, to me, one of the scariest possible combination of words. Another goon, Stinkless 1112, posted a basement description earlier, which seems very apt. I'd like to quote an excerpt from that post. Also, there was a basement which had the whole evil presence thing going on. My mother flat out refused to go in there after the first time she did, and that was during broad daylight. My father only did with the door open and every light in the vicinity on. I remember vividly the feeling of abject terror I felt the one time, to my memory, that I went in there. Not the kind of scared you feel when you're a kid and your mom turns the light out and shuts your room door, but the kind of scared you feel when every horror movie you've ever seen comes to life and coagulates us in the form of suffocating, total darkness punctuated by 100 eyes all staring at you with a deep burning hatred. This is a very good, if understated, description of the feelings invoked. There are some differences. Stinkless basement was cold and seemed to affect everyone, while mine was warm and only affected children. Still, there are enough similarities to make me wonder if our basements may have been siblings born from the very same hell, or perhaps they were even connectees at a deeper level. Some twisted DNA, a basement, in which each of them was only a small part of a larger entity. Okay, that's enough of that particular rant. Here we go to the much longer ranting. It's going to be a long story, filled with many irrelevant details that serve no real purpose other than to demonstrate how clearly I remember it, how it has burned itself into my mind. I don't know how many of you are prepared to read the rambling, incoherent ravings of a madman recounting events from the lunacy of his childhood memories. So at this point you have two choices. B. Skip my post and proceed to the next one. There is no TO. Drive. B. Sit back, relax, settle in, and prepare yourself for the ride. As I mentioned before, my basement story is along the same lines as the evil presence mentioned in the post I quoted above. Is quite a bit more complicated than the other basement story back on page 3, where Crotchapples reported hearing strange noises only to discover that the noises were the result of a brother making out with girls. I'm not saying that there weren't strange noises, there absolutely were, although just how strange is debatable. In retrospect, they may have been and probably were perfectly mundane basement noises, but they did add an element of extra creepiness. Noises like the occasional erratic, metallic clink or thunk, sound of pipes being tapped on, a steady bloop at about 10-second intervals, suggesting a drip from some unseen leak. The sound of rushing water, all of those were likely just plumbing issues. Less frequently, I would hear a low moaning sound, which quite probably was just wind somehow entering from outside or circulating in some plumbing vents. Looking back, there are many completely rational explanations for such noises, and it's likely that every old basement in every old house makes noises like these. At the time, though, in my young mind, they were unfathomably ominous warning sounds. The erratic clink and thunk tapping noises were intentional and were designed to stimulate my curiosity, drawing me down to the basement to investigate. The dripping blew loud, much louder than they had any right to be, and were similarly intended to lure me down in the hopes of shutting off whatever infernal faucet was open. The rushing water noises only served to confuse me, but the moaning, thankfully, it wasn't as constant as the tapping or the drip, but nevertheless it was horrific. It both drew me and repelled me at the same time. I didn't know if it was the call of someone who needed my help, perhaps the last victim who had made the unwise decision to enter that pit, or if it was a chorus of all the voices of previous victims, warning me to stay away. To make it worse, none of the noises sounded entirely real. They all had an artificial quality, like sound effects from a movie, like shaking a piece of sheet metal to recreate the sound of thunder, or clapping coconut halves together for the sound of a horse galloping. I could never and still can't quite place my finger on it, but something about the noises was always very off. The not quite right feeling inherent in the sound may have been due to the shape acoustics of the room. All sounds coming through the door from below the staircase seemed to be amplified, and a short echo delay ambience was applied before the sound waves reached my ears. I didn't understand concepts like acoustics at the time. Maybe the alteration of the sounds were simply due to acoustics of the room, causing the sound waves to resonate in such an unusual fashion. But then again, maybe the sounds were altered intentionally to disguise their artificial. Hearing the noises through the open door at the top of the staircase created the feeling that the noises just somehow didn't belong, as if they had actually originated from some other source elsewhere in the universe, but had been transported into the basement through some rift in space-time when the door was shut. The noises could mercifully no longer be heard. All the door didn't muffle the noises, but cancel them out altogether. During my childhood, my family moved around a lot. My father worked for a government agency that would transfer him to different locations on a fairly regular basis. Every year or two, we'd be in a different city or state, moving into a new home. I was probably about 7 years old when we moved into the house with the haunted basement. Perhaps a haunted isn't even the right word to use. It was never really clear to me whether the basement itself was alive, or if something else, something very evil, was residing within the basement. I suppose the distinction is meaningless, because whatever it might have been, its energy was always focused in that one particular part of the house. I'm not certain exactly when, how or why I came to the conclusion that it was haunted, only that it terrified me to my very core. At some point within the first week of moving into this new house, before I had become aware of IT, my natural inclinations toward exploring led me toward the basement, just to play around, as children often want to do at the time. The basement was new to me. It was, in my mind, unexplored territory, and I was a discoverer. And I didn't know any better. It wasn't until much later that I realized it's a bad idea to intrude into areas where something might prefer to be left alone. A sleeping beast is best left undisturbed once awoken. the beast will behave in a manner consistent with its beastly nature. Whatever force it was, it had decided I was unwelcome, and I somehow instinctively knew it didn't want me around. I got the impression that it didn't like me very much at all, or perhaps it did, maybe it liked me a little too much. The door to the basement was just side of the kitchen, in a small utility room entryway, around the corner from the pantry closet. The door's handle was on the left, and hinges on the right. It opened inward toward the stairs, where there was about a 4-foot-long platform before the staircase descended along the left wall. Thinking back on it, this was a pretty poor design, and potentially dangerous to someone who might have been coming up the stairs. The door opening at the wrong moment could easily knock someone down the staircase, or plummeting over the railing, of course. I never thought about such things at the time. There was a light switch on the left wall just inside the door. From the doorway at the top of the staircase, I couldn't actually see much of the basement. Even if I flipped on the light switch, the light illuminated the stairs well enough. But not much of the basement itself. That godforsaken room seemed to be shrouded in perpetual darkness. I could just barely make out the shape of the washing machine at the far right of my field of view. The basement stank as well, standing atop the stairs. I could smell a very unpleasant, musty odor and feel hot, dank air emanating up from within those murky depths. I could also feel a presence like it was both sentient and secretive. It knew something I didn't, and it wouldn't reveal its dark secrets unless I went down and succumbed to its clutches. At times, it seemed only to be playfully mischievous, trying to coax me, and at other times there was no mistaking that the basement had wicked, malevolent intentions. I never actually even set foot inside it. I was too frightened, just looking down into it. I could feel the small hairs all over my body standing on end, as if even my very skin could sense the danger that lurked within that subterranean crypt, awaiting my arrival. I distinctly remember standing in the doorway at the top of the stairs, staring down into the emptiness, the dark abyss of the unknown and unknowable, desperately trying to muster up enough courage to descend into what I was convinced must be a magical portal to some other world, simultaneously wondrous and terrifying. I could never do it. Fear would paralyze me before I could take even the first step down that foreboding staircase. I would stand there and in complete and utter horror, sweating, on the verge of tears, until eventually something would snap and I'd regain just enough control of myself to run away and run. I did every single time. Eventually, my fear of the basement and whatever unimaginable evils lurked within extended to even the doorway which led to that monstrous room. I began to avoid even the door to the basement, as if getting too close to the door would cause me to be sucked in, or I would surely suffer unspeakable atrocities. I would do my best to keep at least 5 feet away from that malignant, venomous doorway. Much like any other child, I had friends who would come to visit, pray, or have the occasional sleepover on a few occasions, when my parents weren't around or weren't paying attention. I would dare my friends to enter the basement. None of them ever did. I never told them exactly why the basement was a scary place, and to be honest, I really didn't understand it myself. I still don't. They all seemed very willing to take the dare. But as they approached the door, they always faltered. One of them, Paul, came closer than most, and admittedly closer than I ever had. He walked down the stairway to almost the halfway point, where he froze, solid. After a moment, he turned and bolted back up to the stairs. He didn't stop once he reached the kitchen. Either he kept running straight through, and locked himself in the bathroom for 10 or 15 minutes. When he finally came out, he was sweating, shaking all over, and unable to maintain eye contact with anyone for the rest of the night. He refused to talk about it. My parents seemed to think that he might be ill, and they called his parents to express their concerns. I don't know exactly what transpired in that phone call, but I guess it was decided that everything was okay, because Paul's parents didn't come pick him up, at least not right then. In the middle of the night, Paul woke me up and said that he had to go home. I told him to shut up. I wanted to go back to sleep. He started crying and babbling about wanting to go home after a little while. The noise woke my parents up. It was tremendously embarrassing to me. I was sure they'd never allow another sleepover after this. Kid woke them up in the middle of the night with his blubbering. After all, he was my friend. I was the one who invited him here. And now he's causing problems, interrupting their sleep, they told me. It was okay. Sometimes kids get scared for no reason. They said the best thing to do would be to let him go home, and maybe it would help him to feel better. My father made the phone call. He woke Paul's mother and explained as best he could the situation to her. Then he gave the phone to Paul. Paul immediately started crying. The moment the phone was put into his hand, he begged his mother to come pick him up, that he needed to go home. I can still hear the tone in his voice, and the way he stretched out the vowel E in the word need, and the owned home. He told us all that was feeling sick, but he couldn't look any of us in the eye, and I could see the look of abject terror on his face. I knew it was the basement that had frightened him away from my house. I felt bad for daring him to go down there. He wound up gathering the few belongings he had brought with him, and my father drove him home. Paul and I never spoke much after that. It was almost like we weren't friends anymore. For some reason, over the short course of time that I lived there, I'd see him at school and he'd usually avert his gaze, as though there was some unspoken thing which he didn't want to acknowledge in any case. We weren't ever really friends again after that. He seemed to get very uncomfortable around me and distanced himself. In fact, I don't think I ever saw him have any friends at all for the rest of the time I went to school there. It's not really pertinent to the story, but a few years ago, my mother sent me an email containing a web link to a news story about Paul. She'd stayed in contact with his parents throughout the years. As it turned out, Paul had grown up, as we all do, married a very nice woman, and had 2 children. He also got a job as a school teacher in the same town and school district where I first met him. Apparently, at some point, while he was teaching 3rd grade students, Paul developed an unhealthy liking of 9-year-old girls. One of his students had come forward with allegations of molestation, and she was quickly followed by several other girls he had taught. While he was awaiting trial on multiple charges, he died from a self-administered rapid overdose of lead poisoning delivered directly to his brain via the barrel of a shotgun. Judging from the reactions of every single one of my childhood friends who ever came into close contact with the basement, we children seemed to be, in some fashion, attuned to the presence of whatever was lurking within it. We could sense it, even though adults were entirely unaware of it, and thus unaffected. My parents never showed any signs of being frightened by the basement at all. I never mentioned my fear to them, for a variety of completely illogical and nonsensical reasons that I'll attempt to explain later. Occasionally, I'd see my mother coming up from the basement, usually carrying a hamper full of clean laundry. I was incomplete of how courageous she was to have willingly gone into and surprisingly returned safely from that abomination beneath the house. I don't recall ever seeing her enter the basement, only seeing her return. I may have just blacked out any memory of seeing her enter as the thought would have been too traumatic for my young mind to cope with. I'd like to think that if I'd seen her entering the dreadful tomb, I would have warned her not to go, even pleaded with her if necessary. Truth is, I probably wouldn't have. I would probably have been too afraid to voice my objections. Knowing that the basement might hear me, I knew that it was evil, and I knew that it was dangerous. Yet I had the suspicion that just maybe, it didn't know that I knew somehow. My intuition told me that I'd be safer if I didn't let it find out that I knew about it, as long as it didn't know I was aware of it. I could avoid it, but if it found out that I knew, it would have to get rid of me for the rest of the time that we lived in that house. I avoided the door like some demonic infectious disease that was absolutely, without any doubt, determined to destroy me. Or worse, as I said before, I didn't mention my fear to my parents or anyone else, using my childhood logic. Saying it out loud might awaken the bad thing and bring it directly to me, like some unearthly spectral dog whistle. It seemed to be confined to the basement for now. Perhaps it was even trapped there, and unable to come out. Speaking of it aloud might be like calling its name, which could free it from its underground prison and allow it to come for me. I tried my best to hide my fear, because I somehow knew that if my parents found out about that fiendishly diabolical and loathsome entity, then the basement would be forced to deal with them. As well as old superstitions go, saying something out loud calls it to you, and telling someone else brings it to them. Looking back on it, I suppose they had to know how frightened I was, even though I never told them. I don't think they could have possibly not noticed how consciously I avoided that door, and how quickly I moved when I did have to walk by it. After about a year, we moved out into a different state. I still remember that basement well. What little that I ever actually saw in great detail, and I'll never forget, I would become consumed by sheer terror whenever I came into close proximity to it. Update: more recent times. A couple of years ago, while I was visiting my mother, we were talking, and something reminded me of all this. I don't remember what exactly. I don't even remember what the topic of conversation was at the time. Most likely something inconsequential, but something she said, or something I said, or perhaps something on TV reminded me. All it usually takes is hearing the word basement in an offhanded sort of way. I mentioned it to her. I don't remember exactly what I said, but I remember being shocked by the way she reacted to us. Probably something mostly innocuous, like remember when I was little, how scared I was of the basement. She just stared at me blankly, with a very strange look on her face, and didn't say anything all after a few seconds. Not your usual few seconds. These were seconds that felt like days, or perhaps weeks, timeless, infinite seconds during which I became increasingly uncomfortable. When the silence had reached a deafening crescendo, and my discomfort level had peaked, I tried to change the subject. She wouldn't allow that. To my horror, she only stared at me quizzically and asked me to repeat myself. The remainder of the conversation proceeded something like this. What did you just say? No, never mind. It's nothing, just thinking out loud. No, you weren't. What did you just say? I'm going to get another cup of coffee. Do you want one? Stop avoiding my question. I want to know what you meant. Something about the basement. It's not important, really. Tell me. I was just saying how much it scared me when I was little. Like stare for Mum. I was really glad when we moved out of that house. Like stare for Mum. See, I know. We've never had a basement, of course. I didn't believe her. I even argued with her a little. I described the door, the stairway, the noises, all to no avail. I tried reminding her of the night that Paul came for a sleepover, and how he had awoken so frightened that he refused to stay. She remembered the night, but she insisted that Paul had just gotten sick. I mentioned that the laundry machines were in the basement. She simply had to remember it. She'd been down there many times. She refused to hear any part of it. She remembered the small utility room outside the kitchen, but according to her, the laundry machines had been located in that room. There was no door leading to a downward staircase. After a very frustrating conversation, it seemed that there was simply no way I would ever be able to make her remember, and she seemed to give up on trying to convince me. Later that evening, she brought out an old photo album. She sat down with me and went through photos of every house we had lived in while I was growing up, photos of every location we had ever moved to, every city and states. He could tell me what years we lived in each home and how old I was at the time. She wanted me to point out which house I was talking about. I couldn't identify which particular house it had been, although I could narrow it down to 2 possible houses based simply on my age at the time. Neither one of them looked like the right house. From my memory, the pictures were all familiar to me. I remembered the houses, but I couldn't place precisely which one of them it had been, since none of them looked quite right. She could narrow it down to one particular house, being that it was the town where we had met Paul's family. She swore that it didn't have a basement, nor did ANY home we'd ever lived in. I sometimes wonder if perhaps the basement managed to somehow erase itself from her memory. Of course, that would mean that it had altered my memory as well, rendering me unable to identify the house in which it dwelt, and thus preventing me from ever disclosing its whereabouts. I try not to think about it too much, or too often, and I've once again decided that I probably shouldn't ever tell this story out loud. Rationally, I realize that there's no real danger in vocalizing any of this, but a part of me still thinks that there just might be. I have nothing to gain by saying it out loud, but I also stand to lose nothing by remaining silent about it, just in case it can still hear me. The second story, the Ozark Cable Incident. As a child, I grew up in a small southern Missouri town. As north of the Ozark mountain range, there were about 10,000 people living there, and for the most part, they preferred to keep to themselves. It was a weird mentality you never run into often. In the South, during the summer following my second year of elementary school, all that would change. In this town, there was only one provider for television. It was an old cable provider known as Ozark Cable, which served southern Missouri and northern Arkansas. It only broadcasted 10 channels, and given that satellite wasn't available within 100 miles of my town, I had to make the best of it. In fact, the only children's programming available was Tom and Jerry reruns, which broadcasted out of Little Rock on Saturday mornings. Needless to say, my options for cartoons weren't particularly extraordinary. At the beginning of summer vacation, following 2nd grade, my family received a notice from Ozark Cable, as did the other 10,000 resident town. The statement noted that a new, high-tech broadcasting station was to complete construction just north of town. In addition, my town would now be receiving 30 new channels, including Nickelodeon. I was as excited as any child my age would be. Now, I would finally be able to watch new cartoons anytime during the week. During the 3rd week of summer vacation, the broadcasting station went operational, and my small town finally entered the digital age. Static no longer interrupted regular programming. Show lineups no longer switched without notice. And of course, I finally had Rocco's modern life. Overall, I was a pretty happy 7-year-old kid at S when it started. I heard it first from one of my friends. Apparently, his parents had been watching late night entertainment around midnight, or 1 in the morning, when sporadic interferences in the broadcast began to occur. Images of an eyeless man flashed on the screen for seconds at a time, accompanied by startlingly loud white noise. Apparently, it was loud enough to wake my friend up and settled. His parents contacted the cable provider and notified them about the incident, and were subsequently told that it would be looked into. However, the problem persisted. Eventually, it became so frequent and widespread throughout that my parents actually prohibited me from watching any television between midnight and dawn. Not that I was interested in doing so. Anyways, soon, no one watched any late night television. There were rumors of televisions sporadically turning on and displaying the eyeless man seeming to reach out towards the viewer. They were just rumors. One Thursday morning, while my dad was at work, my mom needed to run into town and pick up a prescription from a local pharmacy. Normally, I was forced to accompany her on her daily expeditions into town, but after begging to stay home to watch the new episode of Ren and Stimpy, she surrendered and left to run her errand. After sneaking a few cookies, I sat in front of the TV and waited for the episode to begin. The episode began as usual, with the catchy theme song and glimpses into the antics of the characters. Then, the picture went black. You can only imagine how enraged I was. I had been waiting all week for this new episode, only to have the channel go out. After parading around the TV room in a fit of childhood frustration, I sat in front of the television, and I waited for the broadcast to resume. A brief spark of static appeared on the screen, and I sat in eager anticipation for the episode to resume. Images of decomposing and assembled bodies filled the screen, accompanied by ear-piercing screams that filled the house. I immediately ran out of the tea room, but not before looking back at the television. A man with bloodied holes for eyes seemed to approach the screen with his livid, decaying arm reaching out. I hid under the dining room table and began to sob hysterically. In my fit-out, nauseated terror, I vomited onto the floor. When my mother came home, she seemed to jump back at the noises that consumed the house, and immediately dropped her bags and pulled me out from under the table. I was hysterical, and my face was pale with fear before I could answer my mother about what was going on. She entered the TV room. The screaming stopped. She unhooked the television when I finally told her what happened. We heard a knock on the door. It was my friend and his parents. He was sobbing and was hiding his face against his mother's shirt. They experienced the same thing I had everyone in town did. Almost immediately, local law enforcement became involved to the nature of the images. After a week of no television and sleeping in my parents' bed, the local police department issued a statement. It wasn't as conclusive as we had wished. About 5 months before the original notice in regards to the new broadcasting center, Ozark Cable bought a piece of land that belonged to a long-abandoned sanitarium and on-site burial ground. In addition to demolishing the decrepit building, over 200 bodies were exhumed and cremated without warrant to make room for the miles of underground cables. Ozark Cable was immediately fined, and its owner was prosecuted after 3 months of legal battles. The cable company eventually shut down, with satellite television taking its place soon after. The source of the images remains unknown. It is also Unknown how the broadcasts even happened in the first place. The third story, Tales of a Ghost Hunter. I am an amateur ghost hunter, and have been since early 2000. In the last 5 years, myself and 3 friends have investigated numerous haunted places, from homes to bridges to graveyards to battlefields, with varying results and experiences. I'm going to share with you part of what I consider to be one of our best investigations, and the only time we have encountered what I can seriously call a dangerous ghost. First, I need to tell you in advance, despite some talk of photography in this post, there are no pictures there. There's several reasons for this. First, I can't post images. Second, I'm not the one that keeps the photograph archives. And most important, I offer my word into every client. We investigate for that I will not release any information or pictures that could in any way pinpoint the location of the investigation to their home. Believe me, most of these people have a hard enough time living normal lives without intrusions from the media. Three-leaskers, crackpots or scam psychics, in case you're wondering, and half thrill seeker, half crackpot, to further protect privacy. I've changed all names involved in this except for those of the 4 ghost hunters. Let me introduce you to them. I'm Josh, currently 25 years old, earning a degree in criminal justice with agonizing slowness while I ghost hunt on weekends. For the first 3 of my ghost hunting years, I did computer work for the Department of Defense. Now I work for a document imaging and archiving company. The degree and the jobs are both just to get me by until I can make my living as a full-time writer, which has always been my dream. Next we have Sarah, 26 years old and a business major. I met her online in '97, and we started hanging out. She was a so-called friend with benefits for a while, but that just sort of stopped happening, and we managed to get out of it while remaining friends with very little effort or heartache really. I don't think we were very compatible that way. She has brown hair and eyes, and is fairly attractive. She was also the first to take me up on my ghost hunting offer back in 2000. Then there's Kevin and Jenna, fraternal twins, who are both 24. Now they share features such as hair and eye color, black and hazel respectively, and had similar noses as well, rather large. But I can't say that in front of Jenna. You could easily guess they're brother and sister. But you might not realize they're twins. They've been very close to each other their whole lives. Kevin is a business major as well. Jenna does history and she's sort of out there, but not in an irritating way. She has just very new age wise, spiritual and open-minded. Both were eager to join me in my new hobby, and signed on about a month after Sarah. We had several investigations before the one I'm about to relate to you. During these early ones, we learned to work as a team, perfected our methods for getting things done, photography, note-taking, etc. And learned to budget the costs involved. Gas, food, and batteries are all expensive, and you end up spending way more on batteries than you might think. More on that later. We also had plenty of time to get used to being tense but bored. Most sessions we don't see, hear, or feel anything out of the ordinary, and a little time to get used to being FUCK, INGSCA. Already, no matter how well prepared you think you are, you're not ready when something happens. Basically, we were a fairly well-oiled machine, all things considered, by the time we took on this mother bitch of a ghost. A word about my stance on ghosts. I am interested in them as a PhD in OME, and there are thousands of reports of ghostly phenomena going back hundreds of years, and even further. The fact that ghostly phenomena occurs is, in my opinion, impossible and silly to dispute weird things happen in certain places, as evidenced by thousands of eyewitness accounts from all types of humanity, photographs, video, and careful scientific observation and investigation. What idea, open to questioning, is whether or not ghosts are the spirits of the deceased, or if there's something else entirely. I personally believe there are multiple causes, because I've encountered multiple types of ghosts. I do believe SOME phenomena are caused by the spirits or souls of the dead. I believe others are caused by a massive build-up of emotion or energy that lingers after the source has gone. Still others, I think, are caused by layman's terms. I don't know how else to put this, a wrinkle in time. These are the ghosts that do the same thing over and over again, perhaps only at certain times of the day or month or year, and completely ignore everything around them. Other phenomena, I believe, are caused by intelligent aware entities that are not deceased because they've never lived on this earth as a human elemental spirits. Demons then, we have things like poltergeists, which are not usually spirits, but rather are reputed to be psycho-encyclical energy from a living human, usually a young male or female, with some repressed emotions. Basically, there's a whole lot of shit about ghosts that humanity doesn't understand yet, and my team of hunters is not specifically trying to answer any of these questions. Our mission is to observe and record, nothing more, and we do it out of a fascination and a love of being creeped out. We don't charge for our work. It costs the people we visit nothing more than the occasional raided fridge, and we don't even do that often since our investigations usually occur long after dinner time. We're usually too nervous to snack much. Anyway, enough philosophy, on to the investigation. The night of the Bloop and Pervert, my family moved up here to Northern Virginia in 1993. My parents came up for a week to go house hunting and dragged me along against my will because I was still a kid. House hunting bored me, so I didn't go with them most days. Choosing to stay in the hotel where we had cable TV and there was a pool and small arcade. One day they came back and my mom told me about a house they'd visited out in the boonies that she had refused to even consider living in because she felt that there was something wrong with the house, particularly the basement. She wouldn't even go down there to look around, though my dad didn't. He says he felt nothing out of the ordinary. I was intrigued, but eventually forgot about it, and we ended up taking a house in the country not far from the one they'd looked at in 2001, with my ghost hunting hobby firmly established. I remembered the house and asked my mom if she could remember exactly where it was. We lived pretty close to it, and she occasionally drove past it on her way to the town of Culpeper, which we visited rarely, preferring Warrenton, as it was closer and less country fried, so she had no trouble giving me directions and a description. I figured I'd drive up there and see if anybody lived in it, and if they did, see if I could talk to them about the place. I was afraid it would be empty, because if it was I wouldn't be able to investigate it. I was dead set against doing anything illegal that might endanger my hobby, so breaking and entering a house that was still up for sale was out of the question. I was lucky though. The place was inhabited of ghost hunting. I had gotten pretty good at speaking with strangers and making them feel like they could talk to me. Small talk inevitably turned to my job and my schooling, and hearing that I worked for the Department of Defense and that I was studying criminal justice probably played to my advantage with some people. Surely if the government would let me into high security places, they could trust me with a ghost story to keep this from getting too long, and it's already going to be. Here's the skinny. The house was owned by a 63-year-old man, who I'll call Woody here. He was an ex-Marine and teacher, had recently retired, and his wife had recently passed away. He looked a lot like Sarge from Survivor, only less hair and heftier. He knew something was not quite right in his house. More importantly, he seemed to have a genuine interest in ghosts. And he seemed lonely. It didn't take much more than a promise to cause no damage to the property and to keep the investigation on the down low, to get him to agree to let us sit up with him one night to see what happened. The four of us set out for Woody's house with the usual gear and plan of action. We had planned to start the ghost hunt after dark, but Woody insisted we show up around 4 p.m., several hours prior to sunset. Between us we had 4 cameras to film into digital, and to tape recorders for interviewing witnesses and general recording during the actual hunt. We each had a notebook with which to record thoughts, feelings, observations, and take notes. We had plenty of water, a first aid kit, 2 cell phones, and we all had pepper spray. Out of the sites we visited were fairly isolated, and you can never be sure who you'll run into. We didn't usually bother with more scientific instruments. We didn't even have anything to gauge temperature with, mostly because our experiences had showed us that if the temperature was going to drop due to the presence of a ghost, we wouldn't need any fucking instruments to tell. We'd be shivering. One side note about the tape recorders. We've tried EVP before, which is where you leave a tape recorder running in some quiet part of the house, hoping the spirit will talk and you'll capture its voice. EVP is bullshit, guys. I know there have been some threads about it here at Scrap. We rarely try it anymore. I am convinced that most ghosts don't talk, the ones that can or do so quite loudly, although it's usually shrieking or screaming and not words, and have no need to whisper into tape recorders. The house stood alone and angry, looking in the middle of a treeless field. The next nearest home was about 100 yards away, over a slope and on the other side of a grove of trees in the distance. The feeling we got was one of intense isolation. We were a bit keyed up, as we always were on the way to a hunt. Anticipation is part of the fun, to be fair. The house didn't look all that bad. It was a pretty good-sized 1-story home, and Woody kept some flowers growing here and there. It really could have used some trees though. Anyway, we pulled into the driveway, leaving our equipment in the car for the time being, and before we got to the door, we were greeted by Woody. He introduced himself to my friends after shaking hands with me. He then invited us and showed us to the den in the back, which I hadn't seen before, having only sat with him in the front family room the day I met him. The den made one thing perfectly clear to us. Woody took his retirement seriously. He had a TV the size of a Hummer and a pool table that wasn't too shabby either. A sliding glass led to a large back deck, and the grill was hot. Woody had decided to cook out for us. It was early May and wasn't raining or stormy for a change. Like I said, I think the guy was lonely. Oh man, he made these pepper jack cheeseburgers that would have made him a fortune if he'd gone into the food service business. He also had endless stories about his time in the Marines, most of them about drunken nights or FNG pranks. He told us a bit about having worked as a mink farmer for a while. To pro tip: minks are fantastic escape artists and they're mean, but the girls got fidgety when they realized that part of the job included slaughtering the mink. So we didn't stick to that subject too long. We ate, chatted, shot some pool, and waited for dark so the vigil could begin. We didn't talk much about the house or the alleged haunting. Since Woody was the only witness, we figured half of the team could interview him while the other half was sitting in the basement. That way any experiences the basement team that couldn't easily be put off as power of suggestion. Inevitably the son decided to abandon us to our fate. It was time to go to work. Rule number 1 for my team was that we broke up into teams of 2 and never left each other's sight when we were on site. The only exception was when one of us had to pee. His or her partner waited just outside the bathroom during those situations. We swapped partners frequently to keep us all feeling like we were on the same level with each other. But for this investigation, it would be myself and Sarah as Team 1, and Kevin and Jenna as Team 2. We walked out to the car to bring in our equipment. First thing you do before going on a ghost hunt is put brand new batteries in all of your gear. First thing you do before BEG, INNING, the ghost hunt is check them. Again, we were not surprised to find that all of our brand new batteries were dead. This is a common phenomenon in ghost hunting. I don't know how or why it happens, but I do know this. Every single time we found our batteries dead, we've had something happen to us that same night. So while it's fucking expensive, and it's also pretty unnerving, we consider it a good omen to find dead batteries. We swap them for fresh ones, and this time everything works. We split up into teams at this point with the intention of searching the outside of the house in the first floor. Woody led myself and Sarah through the house, while Kevin and Jenna checked outside. This search is standard for every hunt and has a number of purposes. First, we want to make sure nobody is hiding on the premises with tricks up their sleeve. Second, we learn the layout of the place. Third, we get a feel for the place. None of us make any claims to being psychic, but even as mundane people can pick up impressions. We can certainly notice areas of low temperature, which often indicate supernatural presence. The search revealed nothing. Even standing at the top of the steps to the basement, neither Sarah or I felt a thing. We brought Kevin and Jenna there, and they also felt nothing. Search concluded. We all made a quick trip to the bathroom and gathering our gear. Sarah had descended alone into the basement while Kevin and Jenna went to interview Woody. We left the basement lights off. We each had a flashlight lantern combo, the kind you can pick up for about $20 at Walmart. I love these little things. We both had ours turned on. Cameras in the other hand. We didn't use straps, and we also made the girls tie their hair back tightly, because stray camera straps and stray hairs can both result in false positive phenomena we've caught on film. I had a small satchel with the tape recorder and a few other things, and down we went. It's difficult to describe in words the awful feeling you get heading deliberately into what you believe is a haunted area. Your body kind of tingles, the hairs on the back of your neck stand straight up, and you start to breathe a little heavily. It's entirely involuntary, and it happens every time. No amount of experience ghost hunting can eliminate fear. Even worse, once we made it to the bottom of the steps, we became acutely aware of something. I don't want to mislead you here. It wasn't like in the ghost stories where we felt we weren't alone any longer, or felt something watching us, or anything corny like that. Picture the word WRONG by itself, in big bold black letters, on a white sheet of paper. That is the feeling this basement gave me. There was just something about it that wasn't quite right. It felt unclean anyway. We searched the area, snapping pictures of everything. The basement was plain. Woody had described what was down there for us, and we found it just as he said. It was basically 2 open rooms spanning the entire length of the house. There were less openings at each end, forming a circle in the room in which the steps ended. There were some boxes, neatly stacked, an old table, and a cheap but heavy metal and wooden rack at the far end filled from top to bottom with paint cans and brushes and such. The second room was liberally covered with newspaper, and there were several sawhorses and a workbench with no tools. Woody had told us he did woodworking as a hobby. He was especially fond of making birdhouses, which a friend of his sold at the local farmers' markets for a few bucks each. But that because of the haunting, he didn't choose the basement anymore except to store paints. He'd put some on his rack that very day and noticed no phenomena when he was down there. We searched the basement quickly and efficiently and settled down to our vigil, planning to wait long into the night if need be. Somewhere up above us, Woody was being carefully interviewed. One of our tape recorders capturing every word while Gavin and Jen asked questions and scribbled notes about what he'd experienced. I stood in the opening closest to the pain track, at the far end from the stairs upward. The satchel was on the floor next to me. The camera and lantern in my hands. Sarah leaned against the sofas. From where I stood, I could see almost the entire basement. From where she stood, she could see the far end better than me. We turned out the lights and waited and waited and waited. We didn't check the time, and we didn't chat much at all. Just a few whispers here and there. It was the same boring yet horribly intense routine we'd done many times over the last year. After a while, we managed to put the dread mostly aside and ignore it. We only had a vague sense of time passing down there. As I said, we weren't checking watches or anything, but we had sat for what turned out to be about 4 hours when we noticed a faint tapping sound, like two fork prongs clicking together, coming from the base of the center wall in about the exact center of the basement. Immediately our lanterns blazed to life and illuminated the area tapped at. It continued, despite the challenging glare of our lights. It seemed to be mocking us. We were thoroughly creeped by this point, but also very excited. We snapped a lot of pictures, both at the tapping origin and all around us. The sound was coming from bare wall. There were no objects, no pipes, no nothing that we saw that could be making that noise. We whispered briefly, discussing what we wanted to do. I tried to start our tape recorder, and fuck me, if the batteries hadn't died again. I told Sarah, and asked her if she wanted to leave. She hesitated, but said she'd stay. So I decided to stay too, really. There wasn't much question we were going to stay. This is what we wanted after all, but damned if I was just going to sit there and listen to the tapping. It took a lot of fucking nerve to turn my back on that sound. Tap, 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 tapped, but I wanted to keep busy. So with the light on, I took to reading the labels of the paint cans on the rack. There must have been 40 of them, every color of the rainbow. Some cans with words like additives and textures, and a few very subtly different shades of tap-tapped, what looked to me like the same color. And anyway, I was pretty swept up in the thrill of educating myself about what kind of paint Woody liked. That was when I heard Sarah give a little gasp and curse. I whirled around, expecting to see a smirking red devil with a pitchfork impaling my girly girl. Instead, I saw that she had been pacing through her own sawhorses and the workbench and had torn hairpins badly across the side of her thigh on a poorly hammered nail. Tap-tapped. I asked if she was all right, and she nodded. Told me she thought so. Then she shocked the hell out of me by undoing her pants and letting them drop to her knees, I guess to check and make sure she wasn't bleeding. Now I have a confession to make. I like seeing girls in their panties. In fact, I'd rather see a girl in panties than see her naked. To be more precise, I'd like to see a LL of you in your panties all the time. I am shameless. So when Sarah decided to drop her pants with her back to me, to see if she was breathing, I held up my light to get a good look. She knew about my little fetish, and I guess by this point was feeling a little pissy more on this later. She told me if I didn't get my light off her ass, I would likely find it shoved up mine. I wasn't about to argue she could do it, and blame it on the ghost tap, and nobody would ever be the wiser. So as she bent to pull her pants back up, I reluctantly turned back to my paint rack, just in time to watch the motherfucker finish T-I-N-G-O-V-E or T-R-T-O-W-A or DM me. I am convinced to this day that it was tipped onto one corner while I was gawking at Sarah, and waited until I turned around to come down on him anyway. I yelled, scrambled back, then tripped my camera, and oh thank God my lantern still in my hands, a last tape recorder. I knew ye well, and it right on the satchel, and the recorder wasn't meant to bear 180 pounds. The rack crashed down within inches of crushing me, and a lot of the paint cans spilled. One landed right beside me and began to spill out. But that wasn't all. The fucking handle on the paint can was FURLUSLY slamming up and down by itself, right against my leg. I screamed like a scared little sissy girl and flung it away with my hand, then pushed myself up onto my feet, getting blue paint all over my hands for my trouble. As the noisy can spun into the corner, all the others off the rack began clacking and clanging as well. It was about this time that I noticed the temperature had dropped drastically. Like I said, I don't need any damned expensive gizmos to tell me if there's a ghost in my face. All of this happened in the span of about 10 seconds. Sarah had whirled around in my first cry of alarm. When the rack fell over, she plainly saw the handle of the blue can clacking by itself, and she panicked just as I panicked. She bolted for the stairs, pants falling back around her knees and me right behind her. I still had my lantern in my left hand, and had left my camera. In the rush she hit the steps and stumbled, and I blindly reached out with my right hand and shoved her along, too scared to realize I was getting paint everywhere. They, Jenna, and Woody had heard the commotion and were waiting when we burst out at the top of the steps. I could still hear the clanging of the paint can as I reached the top and kept running to the front lawn, where we finally stopped, both of us gibbering incoherently. Gavin and Jenna, no stranger to panic previous experiences, rushed out and immediately tried to calm us down, and Jenna talked Sarah into pulling her damn pants up, while Woody stood on the front porch, apparently torn between helping us and gawking at the mess we'd made coming up. After a few minutes of soothing, we were both resting on the grass and trying to relate what had happened. What a fucking mess. All three of them confirmed after things had settled down that they heard the noises as we were coming up the steps. Unfortunately, nobody knew precisely when they stopped, because we were all outside. I apologized to Woody for getting paint all over his basement and stairs and dripping on his floor. He took it all in stride. He actually had a bit of a grin on his face once he realized we were all okay, and told me not to worry about the mess. It was probably the most excitement the old guy had in quite a while. Eva and Jenna went down reluctantly to retrieve my camera and the satchel. The paint cans had stopped clanging, and the place was a godawful mess. But there was nothing supernatural going on when they went down, and they made the usual jokes about us losing our nerve and not being cut out for the game, trying to lighten the mood. Sarah, I didn't find any humor in any of this. I was badly shaken by the rack tipping over. This was a big rack with a lot of heavy paint cans, and I probably barely escaped serious injury. Sarah was even worse. We couldn't coax her back inside the house. And so we gathered our cameras, our lanterns, notebooks, and one remaining tape recorder, and said goodnight to Woody after promising to get in touch and see about doing another vigil. The next morning, we went out to breakfast and did a briefing it. It's always easier to analyze what happened in daylight after sun usually rested asleep. The pictures would be developed shortly, and there was always the hope we might have caught something. The tape recorder I had was destroyed, and we'd have to replace it. But at least with the batteries having been drained, we know we didn't lose any important recordings. Sarah and I both were in agreement that the tapping was very real, seemed to be coming from the same place to both of our ears, and that place contained no easily identifiable explanation for the sound. There was of course the possibility that something inside the wall was making the noise, piping or whatnot. Sarah maintained that she would have not dropped her pants in some dingy-ass basement in the house of a man she barely knew, and that she felt she was coerced by whatever was in the basement. She also mentioned that, in hindsight, she felt herself growing increasingly angry without explanation as the hours in the basement passed, which is something that had not happened to me knowing Sarah like I do. I have to agree that she's not the type to just drop her pants in front of other people. She's not the show-off type, doesn't even expose her navel in her daily dress. We could argue that she was concerned she might be bleeding, and that given her intimate history with me, she felt no embarrassment about uncovering herself for a minute. Because of that argument, we don't really draw any solid conclusions about whether or not she was influenced in our report, but given her statements of growing anger during the night, I'm inclined to believe she was. Later trips to this house further solidified our opinion on this. In the end, Sarah and I did find some humor in this whole incident when we got a picture Jenna and Woody ran to the top of the steps. It seems Woody grabbed one of the cameras on the table, which Kevin and Jenna forgot to take with them. In the heat of the moment, while myself and Sarah were panicking on the front lawn, and Kevin and Jenna were frantically trying to calm us down, Woody snapped a couple of pictures, and nobody noticed. We got our photos back, and they contained nothing the least bit ghostly. What they did have was a great picture of Sarah from the rear, pants around her knees and an almost perfectly formed blue handprint, and on her ass where I pushed her going up the steps. Thus was this investigation unofficially christened the Night of the Blue Pump Pervert. So that's the story of our first trip to Woody's house. I'm writing it now because I got word from his family the other day that he's in the hospital. Heart is failing, and they're not sure he's going to make it. He has remained something of any friend since our investigation at his house, and I guess this is my way of dealing with the news that he's dying. The four of us are going to visit him this weekend. I've been revising this for the past 2 days, and I'm going to stop where I'll never actually get it posted. I'll answer any questions about ghost hunting or whatever, if there's sufficient interest. Also, we made 2 more trips to Woody's house, and something happened both times. In fact, things got increasingly hostile each time. If you guys want, I'll try to do a couple shorter write-ups about those 2 trips during the weekend. I also encourage others to post their experiences in this thread. Here's part 2. I didn't do anywhere near as much revising on this one as I did on the first, so forgive me if it's not quite as well written. Enjoy. The following Saturday we returned to Woody's house, armed with pizza for dinner and the revelations of Kevin and Jenna's interview with Woody, which we had listened to, discussed, transcribed, and practically memorized during idle moments of the week. All 4 of us were eager to get back there. and I'd been on the phone with Woody several times during the week. He'd cleaned up the basement, but at my request, had left the rack lying flat on the floor, pushed into a corner with the paint cans stacked in the gaps between the shelves. I didn't want to risk injury or another mess from that stupid rack. Woody's interview gave us good details of the phenomena. Firstly, it was confined entirely to the basement and the stairs leading down to it. Footsteps were common on the stairs. They occurred seemingly at random, always descending. Woody had counted them before, and by his reckoning there were always 22 steps taken down a flight that had only 12 actual steps. Huge, easy horror music. Low Tax's avatar has nearly made me piss myself about 4 times now, on 3 separate occasions that he could recall. He told us he heard the footsteps coming down the stairs while he was in the basement. He saw nothing, and unsurprisingly, after experiencing this, he usually made a hasty exit. He was aware of the tapping sound. It was high-pitched and had a ringing aftertone, as I described it previously. Much like fork, prongs tapping together, he also heard what he thought was the sound of someone heavily dragging their feet on the basement floor. This always occurred while he was in the basement, on the far side where he kept the sawhorses and the abandoned workbench. He got up his nerve enough to take a look a few times, and never saw anything. He told us that he and his wife had discussed the basement many times. She had it worse than he did. She experienced all of the phenomena he did, as well as very sudden, noticeable drops in temperature. In the basement, the feeling of anger Sarah experienced was also something she had reported, along with a strong sense of resentment, though without what exactly she could never figure out. On 3 separate occasions, she felt touches on her back, near the shoulder blades. She had told Woody they were light, persistent, and while not obviously hostile, they felt threatening. I should note at this point that he made it very clear most of the time the basement was just a basement. To have anything out of the ordinary is zero, and his abandoning the area, except for use as a paint storage area, was more out of the general creepiness of the place than out of too many phenomena. He had lived in the house for 3 years. Plenty of time to get used to it mostly, and come to terms with it, and to track its heaviest manifestations were always in late winter and early spring. Things were usually very peaceful. In early fall, occasional footsteps was about all. Anyway, that's the gist of the interview. Dinner concluded. We chatted about the house, the interview, the week before, and our expectations for this visit. Frankly, I thought it was slim odds that we'd have 2 encounters and 2 visits, but it was early spring, and once again when we went to the car for our gear, we found our batteries drained. Evan and Jen wanted to go down into the basement on this trip. Sarah wasn't eager to go down there again, and I didn't want to leave her alone with Woody, so I decided I'd stay up top with her. We searched the house just before nightfall, taking pictures and making sure we were alone and that nothing was out of the ordinary. When it was good and dark, and after a quick trip to the restroom, they went down. What follows is all based on their stories and writings. I didn't see any of this myself. Upon their descent, Jenna was immediately aware of the negative vibes. I've said before that she was very open-minded and had a spiritualist bent. I think she was much more perceptive and aware of this sort of thing than the rest of us. She began to feel irritated. Almost immediately, Kevin felt nothing beside the usual tension one feels on a ghost hunt. They quickly searched the basement. I had asked them to take a good look at the sawhorses to try and find the nail that Sarah or Urban's on, and to take pictures from all angles. I'd love to be able to say they didn't find any badly hammered nails that I saw METAITL, the stuff caused it, but this is reality if a bit surreal. And there was a nail on one of the horses that could have easily resulted in a tear at about mid-thigh. That taken care of, they examined in detail the spot where the tapping sound had come from on the previous visit. They knocked on the wall. It seemed quite solid. They felt the ground and the ceiling, both normal temperatures. No vibrations, it was just a wall. Kevin decided to stand near the bottom of the stairs. After interviewing Woody, he thought they might be a focal point of the haunting. He also wanted to stay far away from the wreck, even with it lying on the floor. Jen, I took up position on a sofa as much as Sarah had done, but only after pushing the one with the bad nail into an angle where she wouldn't possibly bump into it. And so their lights went out, and they waited. Sarah and I passed our time with Woody. We didn't watch TV or shoot pool, because we didn't want to make any noises that the other team might misinterpret her. He mostly spun yarns from his marine day. She had a million of them, and was just the coolest old guy ever. Anyway, the hours passed for us. Probably much quicker than for poor Kevin and Jenna. About 2 hours into the vigil, they heard the tapping sound begin. It was very faint, from the same spot as the last time once again. Lighting the room showed nothing, nor did the pictures they took, and as it was faint and intermittent, after a little while, they found the courage to turn off the lights and sit in the dark again. Kevin had begun to become aware of the sense of wrong, and Jenna continued to be aware of a mounting sense of anger within her and in the room. After about half an hour of random taps, the room fell silent again. They sat for approximately another hour. When Jenna stood up to stretch and shift position, when she dropped her hands after stretching, she banged her left hand on the soffers, and Gavin heard her give the soffers a shove and say, "Fucking cunt." He was very surprised by this. Jenna wasn't a choir girl by any stretch of the imagination, but none of us had ever heard her utter the word cunt before, and she said it with vigor, almost spat. The word was how he described it. He talked to her for a few minutes, making sure she wasn't hurting, tried to get a sense of her emotional state. She told him she felt angry, but that she was in control, and that she wanted to stay down. He decided everything was fine, and he also wanted to stay. So again they fell silent and waited. Another 2 hours passed with nothing. It was now very late at night. Sarah and I were getting restless. Though Woody was an inexhaustible fountain of energy, we were playing cards. I'm not a big fan of Texas Hold'em, but I loves me some 5-card draw and some tonk. Kevin began to hear a thumping sound at this point. It wasn't loud, and it was coming from over near Jen. He held his ground, listening to it for a few moments to make sure it wasn't a trick of the imagination. Then he flicked on his lantern to find Jenna at the nest and lay pounding her right fist against the soffers. He called her a jerk, told her to knock it off, and switched out the light. A few minutes passed and the pounding began again. He was about to ask Jen what the fuck her problem was when he heard a sound directly in front of him. He said it sounded much like someone dragging their feet heavily, just as Woody had described. By this point he was ready to lose it, but he whispered and asked Jenna if she heard the noise, and she confirmed that she did. "Well then quit fucking drumming on the sofa so we can hear it better. Sorry," she said. The drumming stopped, but the dragging continued. It seemed to move away from Kevin, towards the paint track and the far opening to the back half of the basement where Jenna sat. He saw nothing, but the temperature was beginning to drop dramatically. and then again, he hears the pounding, coming from Jenna's sofas this time. It's louder, the room is fucking freezing. He still hears something dragging its damn feet, and he's so focused on hearing as in trying to ignore the pounding that it takes him a moment to consider that perhaps he should check on Jenna. Jenna? He says her lantern comes on and she immediately bursts into tears. The dragging sound stops immediately, but it's still a skull in the room. He switches on his lantern, books over to Jenna and grabs her arm. It's bleeding from where she's been pounding it against the sofas, and she's practically hysterical, sobbing loudly. He pulls her over to the stairs and they book it out of the basement. Sarah, Woody and I are waiting just near the top, having heard Jenna crying, and as soon as I saw her, I ran for the first aid kit. The one time I can remember breaking the rule of never going solo for even a moment, and fuck me, running out alone into the dark on a lonely country road to retrieve a first aid kit from a car was no walk in the park itself. Ghosts, UFOs, ask with S. You just never know. Kevin was still pretty coherent, much more than I was when I came up the previous week, and noted in his observations later that the cold air stopped immediately at the lip of the top step. It was like passing out of a block of ice, he said. Woody at this point was deeply concerned. One of us had been hurt, though after calming her down enough to clean the wound, we saw it really wasn't that bad. She just rubbed off the first layer or two of skin and caused some capillaries to bleed. We questioned her at length. She wasn't really aware that she was pounding her fist against the sofas. That's why she started crying when she turned on the light and looked at her arm. The suddenly realization she was hurt scared the hell out of her. She clearly remembered the temperature drop and the foot dragging sound, which had come from around the opposite side of the wall she sat facing and stopped right next to her. Throughout the night, she said she felt increasingly irritated and angry, up until the foot dragging sound started, at which point she said she felt much closer to just plain blind rage, and felt a wide deep resentment at whatever was making the sound. Woody was reluctant to let us continue after the injury. I told him I'd call him after we'd debriefed ourselves and we'd talk, and thus, part 2 is finished. I've already told you guys we went back one more time. Hopefully, I can get that risen up tomorrow sometime. Here's part 3. This was much harder to write than I thought it would be. I'll post my conclusions in the morning. I'm exhausted now. Hope you enjoy. Despite Woody's concerns for our safety, he agreed to let us try again, and our third and what would be final probe into the mystery of Woody's haunting began with dinner at a restaurant in Warrenton by the name of Tippy's Taco House. Woody drove up and joined us. The place has really good food. We had discussed the events of the previous 2 weeks in great depth. It was plain to all of us that whatever we were dealing with had a particular affinity for females, and we were willing to take Woody at his word when he said the phenomenon was heaviest in the early spring. Certainly we hadn't been disappointed thus far. Attempts had been made to research the property prior to Woody's ownership. It was indicated that the house that currently stood was at least the second time the site had been built on. Probably more than that we had no evidence of a death or anything heinous having occurred there, however. Basically a dead end. So we just sat down and put logic to work. What had happened in this area over the past few hundred years? Our first thought, of course, was the Civil War. We weren't far from Manassas, where 2 battles had been fought. A little further in the other direction was Fredericksburg, another major battle site. There are numerous markers along the major roads in our area with little historical tidbits about armies that passed through on their way to this battle, or that, undoubtedly, there was plenty of conflict and plenty of death in the history of our region. We'd had experiences with Civil War ghosts before, so it wasn't a stretch to consider that we had another. We thought about the Underground Railroad, as well perhaps the ground the house was built on once held a ways top, and something bad had happened. There was probably a Native American presence in the area in the earliest days, and then there was always the possibility it was an elemental or worse, a demon. In other words, we didn't really know. To this day we still don't. Though the events of this third and final night helped us narrow it down considerably. And I tried to convince the girls that they weren't going down this time. We argued about the apparent danger, reminded them of the effects the previous 2 weeks had had on them, but they invoked the power of the vagina and won the day. It was decided that all 4 of us, along with Woody himself, would descend that night. We geared up for lanterns, for cameras, our one surviving recorder, and Woody had a few flashlights on hand, should we need them. We waited till dusk and searched the premises, all was well except for our batteries, which were once again dead. I came pretty close to calling the whole thing off when we discovered that. I've had a very active ghost hunting career, but I've never experienced 3 encounters in 3 weeks. Not once before this incident, and not once since for at least a few minutes on this final night. I really did not want to go through it all again, but my ambition and love of my hobby kept my mouth shut. It was too good an opportunity to let it pass by. We descended the steps single file, and halfway down all 4 lanterns sputtered and died in momentary panic set until Woody, who was bringing up the rear, turned back and flicked the switch for the lights over the steps. We retreated to the top floor, where no amount of shaking or fiddling could get the lanterns lit again. These types of lanterns aren't battery powered, they have a bulb that lasts so long, and then you toss the thing and buy a new one. They were cheap, and fortunately all 4 of ours had just died to the tune of about $80. They're not cheap in bulk, DAMMIT, and we were reduced to Woody's flashlight collection. Once we sorted that mess out, we again descended the steps, acutely aware that we were not welcome. We all had a very uneasy feeling that night. It felt like all bets were off, and the dead lantern seemed to be a challenge or a warning. Woody stood near the rack with the biggest flashlight. Sarah and I sat on the sawhorses, while Gavin and Jen awaited near the steps. Each of us bears had a flashlight between us. We had decided that we wouldn't allow the girls to get more than a step away from the guys, that we would frequently speak to them to make sure they weren't being fucked with. They related their feelings immediately: dread, anger, resentment. Jenna told us the basement felt different to her this time though, very melancholy. She was convinced something tragic had happened here, but couldn't tell if it was a malicious tragedy, an accident, or what. As I've mentioned, she makes no claim to being psychic, and says she was just interpreting what she felt. We waited in the dark. We made some small talk now and again, mostly checking up on the girls and asking for their feelings. Nothing happened for about the first 2 hours. At that point we heard the first faint tapping. It came from the same place as the previous times, and again we lit the area, saw nothing. It took a bunch of pictures that would show us nothing when developed. The tapping faded away after about 20 minutes, and the minutes dragged by. Jenna and Sarah maintained that they were in control of themselves, though they felt the emotional disturbance very intensely. As for us guys, we felt nothing but creeping dread on the back of our necks. I'd say. Another hour passed, putting us past midnight and into Sunday morning. May 19, 2 quick taps preceded a sudden, and I mean fucking sudden, drop in temperature that was immediately followed by a loud thump right next to where Gavin and Jenna stood. It sounded like something heavy jumping off the steps onto the basement floor. Gavin and Jenna, thoroughly freaked, backpedaled to the sawhorses where Sarah and I stood. All 3 flashlight beams immediately blazed out at the bottom of the steps, and just as quickly dimmed to the point of barely providing any illumination at all. This was probably the most OFUCK moment I'd ever had in my life up until that point. Something else would top it a few seconds later, though we all began babbling at once. We were in the dark. It was freezing cold, and there was some THING fucking around with our flashlights. I raised my voice, telling everyone to shut up and hold still. Let's carry this through to the end and blah blah blah. What I wanted to do was fucking BOLT. I held my ground. So did the rest of them. We heard the sound of dragging feet. I hadn't heard it prior to this, and it gave me the impression of someone in a great deal of pain, slowly slogging his or her way across the basement. It moved with agonizing slowness. A 3-legged turtle could have moved faster, of course. Always slows down during an OFUCK moment, so maybe my perception was just screwed up. Kev jerked Jenna back over near the stairs to watch and listen. I could hear them, and the others breathing very heavily beneath the sound. It followed the same path Kev and had described it, taking from the steps across the first half of the basement to the rack. Woody still had some of the badass marine in him. He held his ground as it went right past him, through the opening to the second half where the sawhorses were. Sarah and I were pretty much rooted to the spot. Even with this thing bearing down on us, we stared in the direction it was coming, the pitiful remnant of our flashlight barely illuminating the space a foot in front of us. It shuffled up next to us, and I don't want to say it materialized, because it didn't. It was just there. It had clear, distinct legs, colorless, as ghosts tend to be, I get, but not transparent like some supposedly art wore what I can only call old-time while-looking shoes, with socks or stockings that ended just below the knee. Above there was just whiteness. I got the impression that it was covered in a sheet, or perhaps wrapped in a cloak or cape. One thing's for sure, it had a hugely swollen belly. I think it was very, very pregnant. At chest level it began to become very indistinct, and it had no shoulders, neck or head. I'm not saying it had been decapitated, just that for whatever reason it didn't manifest itself above the chest. It's hard to describe how the thing looked up top. You know how artists rough out a basic sketch of something they're drawing, and then a detail and polish until it looks like it should? That's the best way to describe this thing above the chest. It was like an artist roughed it out and didn't finish it. There was no tapering to where the neck should be, just white streaks that continued up well above where the head would be. It was only there for about 5 seconds, but it really felt like an eternity. I know that's glitch to say, but it's true. I just stared at it. I was aware of how god-awful cold it was in the room, and vaguely aware of the other for people there with me gawking at this thing. I remember being thankful that it had no eyes, and I felt a profound sense of achievement. I'd waited my whole life to see a ghost. I'd heard plenty of them prior to this. I'd felt their presence, but I'd never seen one. It wasn't as thrilling as I thought it would be, though. More than anything, I felt a deep, unrelenting sorrow for whoever or whatever this was, but behind those feelings were words of warning, and friendly, and clean wrong. It faded away, only took a couple of seconds. But it did so much slower than it appeared, Sarah, and I felt something disturb the air, running past us toward the steps, but Kevin and Jenna, who were standing at the bottom of said steps, felt nothing when it was gone. Our lights blazed back to full brightness, and we fucking panicked like we've never panicked before. It played out much like the first night, except this time nobody had their heads together enough to calm the rest of us down. We ended up on the front lawn, panting and trembling, and slowly we regained control of ourselves. I think we all wanted to talk it over, but we kept it short, preferring to stick to our rule of waiting until the next morning after some sleep and breakfast to debrief ourselves and start work on our official report. It was about 1:30 on the morning of the 19th when we left Woody's house. He told us he'd be okay alone. He's a tough old bastard, and knew that there was nothing wrong with the house besides the basement. So we all went home and fell asleep. There's some suggestions most ghost hunters make to people who are interested in trying it out for the first time. Talk to the ghosts. It sounds silly, but what you're supposed to do when you arrive on site is explain to the ghosts who you are, what you're doing there, and politely ask them to allow their pictures to be taken. You're also supposed to make it very clear to them when you leave that they are not permitted to follow you home, that they must remain where they are in the name of Jesus or whoever you wish to invoke. Despite the cheesiness of it, our team does that before and after every hunt. I'm not convinced it works though. I woke up at about 4 a.m. that same night. My TV had switched on by itself. A few minutes later my phone rang. Sarah in a panic. Her TV had done likewise. The next morning we confirmed the same thing had happened to Kevin and Jenna, but not to Woody. And every fucking May 19 since. My TV has turned itself on at some point during the night while I sleep. Same thing happens to the rest of my team. I switch it off and go back to bed. Nothing else the least bit paranormal has ever happened to me outside of my ghost hunts, but I think you can understand that given the apparently hostile nature of the ghost we were dealing with, I don't like it. Such are the risks of ghost hunting, I guess. That next morning we gathered at a little country restaurant accurately named Town Country, complete with a sign boldly proclaiming best in food. They had the best blueberry muffins in the world, were one of the few places I knew of that always served grits, and there was a picture at the register of the owner standing outside the restaurant next to Michael Jordan, who stopped in sometimes on his way through the area Woody joined us. We wanted his input too. We were all pretty tired, but elated we had seen the holy grail of ghost hunting. A fucking scary apparition. But what was it? We don't really know. One of the letdowns of ghost hunting is that there are no convenient wrap-ups at the end that explain everything. Ghost hunting is a mindfuck still. We looked at everything. We hadn't tried to make sense of it, in addition to our other attempts at researching the history of the place. Woody had the contact information of the man who'd sold him the house. He still had it mainly because he was somewhat anal about filing everything, and he continued to get mail addressed to this guy. For some time after he moved, he got in touch with him and asked about any weird experiences. The guy claims he never saw or heard anything out of the ordinary, but admitted that he didn't use the basement for much besides storage and rarely went down there. His wife, on the other hand, disliked the basement immensely, and flat out refused to allow her daughter to go down there at any time. We tried to press for an interview, but the man declined for his wife, so we had confirmation that we weren't the first to experience something down there, but we were going to miss out on the details. Pretty frustrating. But you get used to being cock-blocked in this hobby. Bottom line is our research really didn't get us very far. and we were forced to come up with an explanation based almost entirely on our experiences. Anyway, onto the team's conclusions here. As our thoughts on all of the phenomena, the tapping sound seemed to come from nowhere, was high-pitched and metallic, and was always the first thing heard each night. It almost seemed to be an indication that the ghost was gearing up for the night's activities, or testing us to see how easily we'd freak. I've mentioned the fork prongs thing a couple of times now. Jenna suggested not forks, but a scalpel on a surgical tray. FUCKU, Jenna. Fuck you very much not knowing what was inside the wall of the house at the point the tapping sound came from. We had to accept the fact that it wasn't necessarily supernatural, but we all suspected that it was. The footsteps on the stairs. The team never actually heard anything on the stairs, but footsteps are probably the most common haunting phenomena, so we had no reason to doubt Woody's report here. The fact that he counted 22 steps on a 12-step staircase indicates to me that the ghost was descending stairs that USCD to be on the property, and therefore haunted whatever home or building existed here before Woody's place was built. Woody's place was about 60 years old, so the ghost was at least that old, and I suspect it was much older. The dragging sound, we all heard it, Jenna, and Kevin heard it on 2 separate nights. It started at the bottom of the steps, continued to the far end of the basement, and looped around in the second off room, stopping at the middle where the sawhorses were. No doubt in any of our minds that it was a supernatural manifestation. We really didn't pay the sawhorses as much attention as we should have. We thought the staircase was a natural focal point, but in hindsight, the haunting seemed to be HEAVILY focused on the spot in the room where the sawhorses rested. The touching experienced by Woody's wife. I think it's perfectly clear that this thing focused its energy on females. The fact that the apparition appeared pregnant makes me think it was itself female. Whether it loved them or hated them is debatable, though it's easy to say, because of the negative emotions it impressed upon the girls. Do keep in mind that the only one the ghost appeared to try to specifically harm was me, by tipping the fucking rack over on me anyway. I left the touching out of my overall conclusions, because we heard it from Woody, who heard it from his wife, who could have just been imagining it. If far removed from direct experience to really be something we can count. The emotional impact on our girls. Again, this thing was attracted to women. It's easy to say it disliked them, and that's why they felt such anger and resentment towards the actual entity. Fuck Lotax's avatar just got me again, and it's 11:15 a.m. Matter. Consider the possibility that since it appeared to be a woman itself, it empathites with our girls. And sort of, I guess this is the best way to say, it projected its own feelings onto them. At this point, we have to question Jenna's arming herself on the sufferers. Did the ghost coerce her into doing that? Or was it simply an unconscious effort on her part to use up the energy the negative emotions were giving her? I don't know, but I don't think the ghost did it on purpose. So what have we got thus far? A pregnant female that feels a deep sense of anger and resentment, apparently at herself, who tries to express her despair to other women. At this point, I'd like to remind you just how completely subjective all of this is. Some poltergeist phenomena. The rack didn't tip over by accident. This means we have a ghost that's capable of manipulating the physical environment, which, by the way, in my opinion pretty much rules out The Wrinkle in Time. Ghosts I mentioned in my original post, they tend not to do such things. It's natural to assume that ghosts can do this at will, and that they do it on purpose. I think it's equally likely that they do it entirely by accident, and that it's simply an addicted psycho indicated enough by their presence. Thus, it's impossible to determine if it was a malicious ghost, though it was clearly a dangerous one. Possible awareness again. I believe it projected its emotions onto our girls, and thus, we assume, knew that they were there. It also seemed to openly challenge on the third night by taking our lanterns out of play before we even got down the damn steps. If you accept the fact that it tipped the rack over, and that it did it on purpose, then it's natural to assume it knew I was standing there, and was trying to harm me. Taking all of that into consideration, plus the fact that it's possibly see below visited us all once a year, ever since, and probably will again here in about 2 months, I believe it was aware of us. The apparition, the fact that it didn't manifest all of itself, isn't necessarily telling us anything, though a famous ghost hunter by the name of Elliot O'Donnell passed away in the 1950s. I think once theorized in one of his stories that elemental spirits, having never been human, have a hard time manifesting a complete human form, and either leave parts out or substitute them for something else. In his story, the ghost was an elemental that took the form of a woman, but with a pig's face anyway. That's an interesting side note, but I don't think this was an elemental or demon, and so I don't think it applies here. It is rare to see a completely formed apparition anyway. Pregnancy. The fact that it appeared pregna, I believe, is extremely significant. Was it pregnant when it died? Maybe perhaps the child it carried was very important to it. Maybe it was stillborn, or she miscarried for whatever reason. Pregnancy, and if you want to do a bit of interpretation, fertility and maybe female strength were important to the ghost. And I believe strongly that something unresolved having to do with a child is the cause for the haunting in the first place, which really makes it quite sad when you think about it. The seasonal manifestation, if indeed the ghost in question was pregnant at or near the time of her death, it's not too big a stretch to assume that her baby was born or was at least due in the early spring, when manifestations are most common. That wrong feeling. I've stated that I felt unclean in the basement, that something was just not right, and that the spirit itself was unfriendly and dirty. All 4 of the others felt likewise. I think the wrongness was just our human instincts warning us that something funny was going on with this basement. I believe we all still possess our animal instincts. We just don't have much need to tap into them living in a fairly safe and civilized society. The feeling of uncleanliness could have been another projection of the ghost's own feelings about itself. Perhaps this woman got pregnant out of wedlock, or was raped and subsequently became pregnant during a time when such a thing was considered a very grave sin and would have led to her being outcast. She likely would have felt a deep sense of shame and self-loathing, further leading to the feelings of anger and resentment that she tried to share with the girls. For some reason, thinking about this, I don't think she was Civil War era. I'm thinking even earlier, the yearly visit. Fucked. If I know what to think about this one, since we didn't do jack shit for the ghost beside intrude on its place of sorrow, I doubt it's dropping by to say, "Hey, how's it going?" We have theorized that it's not actually the ghost at all, but that we were simply moved by our experience, that our subconscious fires off a burst of psycho-kinetic energy on the anniversary and end up activating something in the house to wake us up. And having said that, now's a good time to mention just how much this experience did affect all of us. If it's any indication, I'm typing this line with tears in my eyes even for years after the fact. I can get extremely worked up about it. It was without a doubt one of the most intense experiences of my life, and my view of the world changed afterward. It has convinced me that emotions and instincts of power have energy, and that even though science can't explain how, we are more than capable of picking up on these things from each other. It has heavily influenced my desire to continue ghost hunting. Woody has remained in the house in the years since, rarely using the basement. He maintains that it's still haunted, hearing footsteps about twice monthly, except in the early spring when it's far more common. We've never been back. We haven't even really been tempted to go back. I feel we overstayed our welcome, and I'm smart enough to bow out gracefully. So there you go.